Welcome to the Haven Collective. I'm JR, and this is the Beacon Bit. Today we're talking about Jesus' lament over Jerusalem. So I want to begin by asking the question, what is the last really big risk that you took? Maybe that could be a relational risk. Maybe you, took a big trip by yourself or something like that. Maybe you took a risk in applying for a new job. What was it? What was the last big risk you took? Risks are often scary for us specifically because they make us vulnerable, right? They expose us. In fact, if they don't make us vulnerable, they're not a risk because we're not risking anything, right? It's entirely possible for me to do something, enter into a conversation or something like that and not put myself at risk because I'm not making myself vulnerable, whereas you could do the same thing and it would expose you, right? That's what vulnerability is. That's what makes a risk a risk. Well, today's text is Jesus talking about how he is making his way to Jerusalem. It begins with some people coming to warn him that Herod Antipas, who was the ruler over the northern part of Palestine, wanted to kill Jesus, and Jesus was like, don't worry about it. He's just mad that I'm offering universal health care, and he's not going to do anything about it because God's prophets have to be killed in Jerusalem. And then he does this lament, right? Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you kill the prophets. It's this lament. And it's fascinating because if we zoom in just on this text, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But if we look at the longer history of God's people, we see that there has always been this tension between what we're going to call today the capital and the wilderness. We talked about the wilderness last week when we explored the temptation narratives. But the wilderness is the place where God's people's story began, right? God liberated them from Egypt, another capital, took them into the wilderness, and then that's where they learned how to trust God, how to love God, and then they entered into the promised land. And it was a number of years that they lived in the promised land before their capital was established at Jerusalem by David, the famous King David, right? And you might think that this would be a unambiguously good thing, but there's this weird tension in the story about David. And it's that Jerusalem almost acts like a political kryptonite for him. The further David is away from Jerusalem, both literally in terms of geography, and then also metaphorically in terms of power, the more he has God's favor and the more effective he is. So when he's on the run from King Saul, for instance, early in his life, and Saul is the ruler, so David is very, metaphorically far from the seat of power, he's successful in everything he does. But once he becomes king, it's almost like it begins to rot him. So the famous story of his assault of Bathsheba, but also later in his life, once his sons are trying to take over his throne, his son Absalom usurps his throne, and then David, he tries to kill David, but David escapes from the city, goes on the run, and again, it's once he's away from the capital that he becomes successful again and is successfully able to take back his throne. So it's this weird tension that people have noticed that actually, when it comes to God's people, the seat of political power seems to be a rot. And Jesus understands this. He says, there's a reason that God's most beloved prophets have all met their fate in Jerusalem, because the closer that holy people get to the center of power, the more dangerous it becomes for them. They either become corrupted or they get killed. And of course, you know what it was for Jesus, right? This is the core danger of Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism trades faithfulness to God for a seat at the political table. It trades being faithful to the way of God, caring for the most vulnerable, standing up for those who are being exploited, speaking truth to power. It trades all of that for proximity to power. And Jesus knows this. Jesus knows that power is the death knell for faithfulness, that the surest way to get a person of God to forsake the way of God is to hand them power. One of my favorite writers, Greg Boyd, says the quickest way to get a Christian to put down a cross is to hand them a sword. Right? And so this is what Jesus is lamenting. He says, I know we're making our way to Jerusalem where I'm going to take God's message, but we know how that's going to end for me because it's how it ends for every prophet who goes to the seat of power. And that makes sense when you think about it, because what does power do, right? Power closes us down. Power makes us feel safe. It makes it so that we want to just kind of like hunker down and be and make sure that we keep everyone else out. The wilderness, as a space of risk, as a space of vulnerability, necessarily opens us up. When we're in the wilderness, when we can't only rely on ourselves, we're forced to be open to the other, to welcome strangers and immigrants, to care for the most vulnerable, because often we too are the most vulnerable. And that's a scary, difficult place for us to be. So we want to seek power. We want to seek the ability to protect ourselves, to get that safety and security and success that the idols of Christian nationalism promise us, right? And so this is why it's so dangerous for faith, because when we have power, we don't need God, so we think. This is why the wilderness is such a beautiful place for us to connect with God. So what we're going to talk about this week is why churches are so lured by the idol of Christian nationalism. And we're going to talk about Haven's model, because it is very different intentionally in the way we negotiate power and the way we seek that. And so I look forward to us talking about risk, about vulnerability, and about how we see Christian nationalism playing out, and most importantly, how we can resist that. Until then, I hope you have a great week. I hope you sense the Holy Spirit with you. Grace and peace go with you.